where to make edits. So we'll see. It might be too much.
Aquela água, a Thay ia deixar ali, mas ela tirou em forma. Aí já puxou.
Hello. Hello, very nice meeting. Yes. I'm sorry to hear.
So they just called it, she went there. I'm sorry to.
And nobody
For Janina, no.
I mean for Janina.
Yes, no. So I'm sorry to say.
So we are left with three.
That's right. I thought that she would place in this.
Thank you.
I'm sorry to be
Very
such
kind.
a short notice.
I hope she gets well soon.
Yeah.
Please. No, you can sit. So yours is a joint group?
Yeah.
So how many you want to have before the break? Two or one? Now there are only
Good question.
one and a half.
I think we should have two actually.
Two.
Two, and then we will have a general discussion after the final presentation. This is more complicated. And you have a general view, and since we are sensitive about time, we are trying to prove to the audience that we were ready for duty. We were ready for duty in time, on time. Has arrived, she is here. Alexander is also going to join us. The allocated time is 20 minutes, so to be fair, in spite of the fact that we are missing these people, let us stick together. I will request from you in 4 or 5 sentences to introduce yourself. It was happened earlier today. I believe that everyone should know who is speaking is. How good, yeah.
You would like 4 sentences about me.
Yes. No, I was suggesting that. Careful.
Oopsie.
Don't say anything about. Second chance. Second one. You'll probably have to. Sitting next to us, so it's walking in the top. We are masters in all this. Experience yourself.
Oh, we voted that.
How long ago? It's a social experience. Yeah, I know. Yes. Meeting people who are very unhappy being there. Good afternoon, all. We are ready, as you can see, but the VIPs have not arrived. Shall we give them another 5 minutes or so? I'll charge them for the delay. Don't worry. Sorry? Our host. Our president. I think the grace period is over once again. Good afternoon. I'm commencing the afternoon session, unfortunately with bad news, because I have just been informed that our first speaker unfortunately has fallen ill. She has sent word that she will not be able to attend. So we are left with 3 speakers. What we are going to do is have 2 speakers, question and answer session and discussion about their presentations, and then have a 15-minute break and have a final presentation. There we will have 2 presenters. Our second presenter for the last one is going to join us soon, and we will have plenty. Oh, he's here. Hello. Hello. Well, I must go and see my doctor when I go back. And therefore, we will have plenty of time for both question and answer and discussion. What I have requested from the panelists is that they will be allocated a 20-minute period. Although we do not have a time pressure, in order to be fair to previous speakers, particularly in the morning, we will have the same time allocation for them. But after that, you and I will decide, we will all decide how to continue on after the break, because we will have some time. I have also requested the panelists that they should, in very briefly, 5 or 6 sentences, introduce themselves. I thought that you'd like to know who you are listening to. I will do the same thing before I give the floor to the first speaker. I'm a political scientist, but all my career I have worked on issues of local, regional, metropolitan governance. and public policy. I have not also studied public policy, but I had the chance during my career to practice it at different levels. I first practiced it in local government while I was serving for deputy mayor of Ankara, the capital city of Turkey. So together with our colleagues, we prepared local policies and we implemented local policies. Sometime later, I had the opportunity this time to serve at national government level as Vice Minister for Tourism. So again, together we, with my co-workers, bureaucrats, we prepared tourism policies at national level and implemented them. Following that, I served on the WTO. This time it's not the trade organization, but World Tourism Organization. And together with the other members, we prepared policies regarding policies at national level and instituted certain new mechanisms. So last but not least, I have worked for a number of civil society institutions. So in the voluntary sector, of course, we also needed policies, and we had a chance to prepare and implement policies for the civil society and non-governmental organizations. So I'm very happy to be here, and we are all going to share our experiences with you. Without further ado, may I ask Paul Klugman, Curry, South Africa, to introduce himself first, and then start his presentation. 20 minutes, please.
Cool. Can you all hear me? Great. I was told not to negotiate about time, but cool. Hi, I'm Paul Curry. I am a researcher at the Urban Modeling and Metabolism Assessment research team in Stellenbosch under my supervisor, Josephine Musongo. I am from Johannesburg and was lucky enough during some rather unfortunate times in South Africa to be skirted off to New York with my parents, where I experienced what a whole new mobility paradigm was at the age of 14. No parents to take me around, and since then I've really been fascinated by how cities function and the sort of je ne sais quoi vibe of what cities actually are. I returned back to South Africa after completing my undergrad in biology and environmental studies, going via India, where I got a sense of what large population actually means for environmental consequences, and joined the Sustainability Institute at Stellenbosch University, where I explored a lot of the themes about poverty and equality, and returned to the question of what cities are, how they function, and how we can address environmental issues therein. I think that's me. So I've rather ambitiously connected two pieces of work and pretended that it can actually fit within 20 minutes. And this has been a thought experiment about what this sort of wider concept of planetary boundaries might mean at local government level. So to position myself and this presentation, it'll fall under Bharat's fifth dimension of global urban policy, which is creating urban knowledge for policy making. And I believe, as does our group, that cities are central in many global processes. They're concentrators of people, of economic activity, of resource consumption, environmental impact, social ills, but they are also the concentrators of opportunities, experimentation, innovation, and more recently, political might. And we've seen the response when Trump dropped out of the Paris Agreement. Cities said, "You fool, we're already following this. We're going to take this forward." At Habitat 3, many local governments have noted that cities are where policy meets people, asking for funds to be delivered directly to cities, not going through intermediaries of national and provincial government. So planetary boundaries, I'm going to assume a general-ish knowledge about it. It's quite a wonderful concept coming out in 2009 from the Stockholm Resilience Center. And my favorite thing about it is it took the notion of environmental sustainability away from low carbon towards a wider sense of biophysical processes, quantifying 7 of 9 of them, and showing that we have actually crossed thresholds into unknown regions for three, in this iteration in 2015, 4 of them. So now we are entering a space we don't actually know how stable our world is going to be. It presents complexity in very simple form, which is useful for decision making, and suggests the possibility of multiple development paths. I would contend this is not just another version of limits to growth, but actually allows you to choose different ways in which to develop and hopefully take on the challenge to be agile therein. I will say that a number of the responses that have emerged have been rather boring, unfortunate, technological, eco-modernist perspectives, claiming political pragmatism, that you can't actually shift an economic paradigm, and therefore technology will be our savior. And what I think planetary boundaries should represent is environmental pragmatism. And this should lead to more effort to quantify what sufficient lifestyles and sufficient production and consumption systems might be. As the gentleman, I'm not sure if he's moved, was saying earlier, and I'd quite be interested to hear his further points. So here, we need to actually explore what sufficient lifestyles might be, what the options of leapfrogging, alternative development pathways might be, and actually boasting about these, trying to take that on as something we're excited about, and not just as a requirement from top down. Here we see potential new forms of global governance, and quite importantly, new calls for science to understand the interrelations between boundaries, as well as understand the social drivers of these boundaries. To govern these, there have been this notion of 2 types of process. One is Earth system process and cumulative processes. So Earth system processes aren't tied to a location, but are global in nature. This is climate change, ocean acidification, and therefore no one country can really understand its role in this. This needs to have global compacts to understand it. Cumulative processes are going to be different for every country, every region, based on their context. And so 2 approaches are rather predominant, which is having the notion of an institution for each boundary, like the IPCC or IPBES, which is going to govern each boundary, whereas a lot of people are saying, well, no, targeted actions are more important. So here, the Montreal Protocol is a very useful case study, because the one boundary that we've actually come back from passing was the ozone stratification depletion, ozone depletion. And so here the Montreal Protocol used international law to say you cannot develop with chlorofluorocarbons. And to me, this signifies that there are no unlimited rights to develop. You cannot develop and put chlorofluorocarbons into the atmosphere. I think that's a useful precedent to take forward. So efforts to scale this down to national level, there have been many. This is my favorite framework, which says that there are these different dimensions, the first being biophysical, which is being cognizant of system versus cumulative processes. First is biophysical. Second is the socioeconomic dimension. This is looking at responsibility of a nation or a city. So are we following a production perspective where what you produce, you're responsible for what you produce within your boundaries, or are we following a consumption perspective, which has a higher embodied, more realistic, but much harder to trace impact? And then an ethical dimension, which looks at principles of equality, so the rights to the environment, sovereignty, the right to use the environment, the right to develop, which is exemption from restraints, responsibility, in which the polluter pays, capacity, in which people who can pay, and voluntarism, in which different countries or local governments choose how they'll contribute. Lots of words. So, of all of this is a very useful paradigm. However, many people have suggested, including Sanders, that no matter how much our scientific capacity to understand or measure these, we will always come back to values as the main driver of these decisions. So the ethical dimension is the most important. All right, so I attempted to see what this boundary might mean to Cape Town, and there was a methodology by Hoenweg et al., who are industrial ecologists, and their methodology produced this image of Cape Town's boundaries. You'll notice that there's only one Earth system process, and the rest are all locally related. And they're somewhat different from the actual boundaries initially. And I think this is an incredibly useful way to understand Cape Town's contribution to global impacts, but it's not necessarily useful to local decision makers. Cape Town is in water crisis over here. I think the land use change is misrepresented in terms of Cape Town's local contribution to issues, as well as we don't know really what our intervention points might be with carbon, given that the nation produces electricity with coal, and how can the city of Cape Town change this? I'm intrigued by social drivers, but my time limit may preclude this. The social drivers of planetary boundary perturbation are missing. People don't really know what the social drivers are, and as part of this, we don't really know what the social tipping points could be, the intervention points could be towards new behaviors. As part of the interest for me, we don't know what the resource or environmental costs of providing sufficient services might be. The most popular effort to try and add social dimension to the planetary boundaries was by Kate Raworth, who suggested that there's a social foundation based on human rights indicators and connected that to an environmental ceiling. The problem with this is that the presentation of this isn't corollary, is corollary. There aren't causal relationships between social drivers and environmental impacts. And so I think for this, we measure social indicators as proportions of access, which actually misses a lot of the aggregate requirements of impact and overlooks some of the challenges or successes with the interventions. This presentation also ignores how income and consumption inequality accentuate social drivers, and it ignores, again, this pragmatic outcome that we need a sufficiency perspective. So this was a response to it. Unfortunately, it's too complex for me to actually explain during the time. And I might have an offer to come back to it in the second round. But this is a notion of a societal service hierarchy in which the way we measure, the way we measure well-being of society is through education, health, safety, and voice, tertiary service, whereas where we make environmental impact is in our primary services, water, energy, and materials. These are directly measurable, and these have embodied impacts. So we can perhaps come back to that. So my sub-conclusions about the exploration of planetary boundaries is that they're better as an organizing concept, as we do not really have pathways which national or state governments can actually follow. We have to address cumulative issues locally. We must connect administrative boundaries with an area of impact, which means a wider conception of cities to include a watershed, a bioregion, perhaps a trade network, quite difficult and idealistic, but there it is. And we need new forms of measuring the current situation as well as interventions. So embodied versus direct resource costs, proportions versus aggregates. I'm pushing for environmental pragmatism to actually take a stand against political pragmatism and for it to actually become a boasting point, not something limiting. With all of this, I still remain that a city is a good unit for understanding societal costs and drivers of environmental degradation. And to this end, my favorite concept, urban metabolism. So through a bit of work, we have come up with a definition of urban metabolism as the collection of complex socio-technical and socio-ecological processes by which flows of materials, energy, people, and information shape the city, service the needs of its populace, and impact the surrounding hinterland. In this way, you can understand a city as a complex, emergent property of relationships, which means if I make one impact in one place, it'll affect the entire city and the entire functioning of the city. And this is a tool that we're using, or a concept that we're using, to promote the notion of circular flows, so bringing waste back into the system. This is very similar to circular economy, but instead focusing on resources. And some of our perspective on this is captured in a new report that came out with the Global Initiative for Resource Efficient Cities, which you can find at this website, resourceefficientcities.org. In that, we look at some of the methods of urban metabolism assessment. There's material flow analysis, which looks at inputs and outputs and tries to understand what's going on inside the city. Impact footprinting, this is ecological footprinting, carbon footprinting. Life cycle analysis, which is trying to understand the embodied consumptive or productive impacts of cities. System dynamics modeling is looking at causal relationships, which I think is very important for understanding how social issues affect resource consumption. And then the many hybrid methods. So the considerations here are choosing a bottom-up or a top-down approach, looking at spatial and temporal detail within a city, looking at different scales of responsibility, looking at causal relationships, and breaking the science policy boundary with transdisciplinary engagements. How do you work out what societies need, especially in our context, what informal settlement dwellers need and want, and how to help them get their needs met. We did a basic urban metabolism assessment of Cape Town as part of a paper that was released. I think there should be a link there, which looked at flows of water, energy, materials, food, waste, and people. And some brief outputs are a shift in identity of Cape Town as a water-sensitive city, and so this means a rather holistic perspective, decentralized solutions away from centralized solutions, requiring behavioral and technical interventions, augmentation schemes, so bringing on desalination using groundwater. This has resulted in resource shifting, so now water is an energy issue because you need tons of energy to take water out of the ocean. For energy, again, most of Cape Town's electricity comes from the national grid, from coal, about 2,600 kilometers away. So what can the city actually do? There have been really great moves to create an embedded generation policy, which means that companies and residents can put solar panels on their roof and contribute to the grid. In transport, 38% of the city's total energy is from private vehicles. So to cite Feroz, death to the single occupancy vehicle, but not long live the single occupancy vehicle. Here you need new strategies to encourage people to take public transport. And this is an example of how energy and transport, two services, are well related. For materials, Cape Town consumes between 3.4 and 13.3 tons per person. More than half of this material input becomes stock, so it's actually going into buildings, so Cape Town is growing. For food, about 11.6 is produced within its boundaries, with, I'm not terribly sure of the number, about 40 or 50% coming from the Western Cape province. It's decentrally distributed, so it's very hard to track, but it's quite useful for a first interaction with informal vendors and engaging in informal settlements. Waste, we have landfill limits. The new landfill they're proposing is about 50 kilometers away from the city, so that means waste will also become an energy issue. We need to properly look at recycling. South Africa underperforms in cyclical metabolic potential, so getting recycling, reduction, and reuse properly into our waste system. And then in people, I've described we need a mobility paradigm shift. There's a new Directorate of Transport in Cape Town, which is doing really interesting work at quantifying where people are coming from and what the push and pull factors towards public transport are. In terms of where people live, 21% of Cape Town's population lives in informal housing, which means we have a really, really big task of upgrading people into either with better services for their homes that they've built or into subsidized housing. We have an interesting concept also from a researcher at Stellenbosch of hypersegregation and class-based segregation taking place in Cape Town. So here, because the city is not investing in social services in some of the under-serviced areas, people with upwards economic mobility move to other areas and they don't invest in that space, which means, again, as we're familiar with poverty traps, you're entrenching poverty in these spaces. So we need the city to actually invest in services in these areas. Oh, I was supposed to jump to this after transportation. The single most unjust aspect of Cape Town, in my opinion, is the fact that our highways look like this on the left for about 2 to 3 hours every day. And this is a familiar picture in most cities where the poor are forced to get stuck in traffic and sit on buses while the rich have their air conditioning in their cars. Again, death to the single occupancy vehicle. So our current understanding of urban metabolism, to use a metaphor, looks like this very beautiful picture of Cape Town. We understand the types of resources that are being used, the quantity of input and output. We can compare the relative sustainability between cities. It's got very linear, direct planning and decision support. For example, the things I've listed before are very top-down, simple focal areas for the city. But it's limited because we know that the city isn't a single entity. There's a lot of heterogeneity across the city. It ignores internal dynamics. It's often relying on top-down estimates, and it's a static time frame, as well as excluding informal flows. We need something a bit more like this, where we can understand neighborhood dynamics. We can direct resources to different neighborhoods. But to get there with a better form of accuracy than top-down estimation, we need to understand this. This is Cape Town by night. We need to look at the individual pixels in here and actually derive different household consumption resource profiles so that we can inform where different resources need to be deployed in different services. So the first part of this work looked at access. We've got water, sanitation, energy for cooking, and waste pickup here. And these are showing a very similar trend where the southeast of the city, where most of the informal settlements are, have lower service provision, despite being on the periphery close to networked infrastructure systems. The new landfill is planned for here, and this is where the main city is built. So as an output of this, we want to understand not just the access, but actually what is the density of resource consumption being consumed in each of these areas to complement this. And unlike most cities where we'd expect density to be in the middle of the city, we have a rather dense population on the periphery, which is probably where we'd expect to find resource consumption. How's my time? Okay. For temporal detail, this is an example of the water situation in Cape Town. We've entered a crisis now. It's wonderful to be in Rio and feel a little less guilty about taking showers. You can see with this type of information, we can see that sorry, let me explain it. So the middle line, these ups and downs are the dam levels. They've been going steadily down since 2015. The higher fluctuations are consumption, steady about 800 million liters per day. And the bar chart are rainfall measurements. And so there's about a 2-month delay between the highest rainfall of the year and the highest level of the dams. And then our highest consumption level is in February, which you can see is where our dam levels go down. So understanding this shows us that it is definitely because of a loss of rain and not through an increase in consumption necessarily that our water crisis has emerged. So interventions in crisis, right now the city showed an incredibly delayed response to this, despite predicting water threats since 2006. And so they finally caught up and are putting in demand-side interventions. Behavioral interventions are very effective in residential sector where people have an ownership over the resource, they have to pay the bills. So step tariff increases, fines, messaging has worked. However, in commercial sector where consumption has actually increased, potentially because people are moving their water consumption there, technical interventions are important. Water management devices, waterless technologies, network pressure reduction. On the supply side, behavioral interventions include securing different water bodies, promoting household level reuse, so using your shower water to flush your toilets, decentralized water stocking, so going to the shop and stocking up on your own water, and then technical supply side interventions are water protection through repairing your water network, reducing the pressure of your water network to reduce leaks, and augmenting your water with groundwater desalination and water reuse. What's interesting is that these interventions are going in now, but they predicted a need for augmentation in 2022. And so we're perfect. We're 5 minutes, 5 years, sorry. We're 5 years early. So yeah, connected numbers, 5 years early in our need for intervention. And so the question is, are these interventions going to represent long-term interventions or just be this responsive short-term thing? So I think crisis is a very useful moment to implement long-term effects, but you need to be prepared for them. So the policy implications of an urban metabolism perspective, we tend to rely on national urban plans. 17 out of 50 African countries actually have national urban plans, with an estimate that only 4 of them have the capacity to actually implement them. Here, cities are incredibly useful as contributors to national urban policies. Cape Town has been incredibly effective in developing policy, which is then pushed up into national policy. This is the embedded generation for renewable energy. Energy wheeling was one of the first cities to get wind power from a neighboring municipality. Wastewater mixing ratios, waste to energy experimentation, and the requirement of in situ informal upgrading came from Johannesburg, Joe Slovo's informal settlement protests. Now it is in law that municipalities cannot remove people but have to invest in upgrading where people are, as long as it's not on precarious land. City government organizations to enable cross-department engagement is very important. There was a Brazilian speaker at a thematic meeting a while back who said that Brazil had a cities ministry. I thought that's a genius idea, and our Department of Human Settlements needs to start operating in such a way. Intermediary organizations, Western Cape has a organization called Green Cape, which connects industry, government, and academia to provide information to business and industry. Slum Dwellers International serves as an incredibly good intermediary for engagements in informal upgrading and understanding what's going on in informal settlements. And then again, cities need to be ready, because crisis is a moment of implementation for long-term policies or strategies in shaping the city. So here, citing the water crisis, another example is a fire in one of our informal settlements, and the minute after this fire, the city went in to help reblocking it with, with roads and space between shacks. Thank you. This is Cape Town.
Thank you very much. You have used your time well. Thank you. Very interesting. Our next speaker, Bharat Dahiya.
So that way, to point with the light.
Very good afternoon to all of you. I first like to congratulate all of you for keeping your concentration alive, because I know that after food it is always a little bit of a challenge to stay alive. I hope that, like Paul, I would not like to put you to sleep. And before I'm supposed to introduce myself, no?
Please do.
Oh, yes. Thank you,
Please.
Corel, for reminder. My name is Bharat Dahiya. I actually come from Delhi, but last 21 years of my life, I've been living in different continents. I worked with the World Bank and UN for several years. So as Robin calls me a practitioner in disguise or something like that. Most of my work has been on helping national and local governments to improve their urban livability. What I have tried to do in my last 15 years of professional career, a little bit more than 15, is to have a balance between practice and theory, which means that while I was working in practice in the UN and World Bank, I try to keep doing academic style work. So keep publishing, co-authored a book at the World Bank on urban livability. And then at the UN, I conceptualized and coordinated the first UN report on Asian cities, which came out a few years ago. For last 3-4 years, I have moved to a university in Bangkok, Chulalongkorn University. We call it Chula for short. And there I try to, being in an academic institution, I try to practice. It's not easy, but what is easy in life? So with that little introduction, I would like to show you this skyline. I was in Yangon, Myanmar last weekend, where there was another conference called ASEAN Development Model. Because ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is a group of 10 Southeast Asian countries. And now it has reached 50 years of its establishment. And so there is a lot of rethinking going on with regard to the ASEAN development model. So through this presentation, I would like to look at the urbanization process, on which there is very little discussion in ASEAN. So this is the kind of skyline every city in Southeast Asia used to have at one point. And nowadays, every city wants to be like this. This is the tallest building in Bangkok, called Mahanakhon, which literally means the large city, which was opened last year. And there was a big light show done, because the structure and the architecture of the building is like this. And there was a lot of criticism that all the money that was spent on the light show could have been used to help the several hundred slum communities which exist in Bangkok. Anyway, this is another view of Bangkok, close to from where I live. And so the talk today is ASEAN at 50, recalibrating public policy for sustainable urbanization in Southeast Asia. I have divided this in 3 parts. First is the ASEAN development model and the economic role of cities. Second is to do with sustainability, which is the theme of this session, looking at urbanization and its connections with the consumption and environment. And the third is to look at how, what are the policy discussions and what are the problems behind all these issues. Okay, so taking cue from our inverted map, I inverted the map of Southeast Asia, if you are wondering what that is, because Corel was saying to me that why the map is upright. So this map shows the 10 countries which are part of the ASEAN. 5 of them were called the founding members, which joined in 1967. And the reason this bloc was created was to have a security and peace in Southeast Asia, because there was a threat of spread of communism from USSR and China at that time. So you see the 5 countries that joined, they were aligned with the US, and the other, except for Brunei, the other 4 have had some communist or military influence. So it's a very interesting combination of countries which have somehow, for all kind of geo-historical reasons, have come together in form of a economic bloc, if you like. So a few years ago, these 2 scholars said that since mid-80s, the key features of the ASEAN economic model is export-oriented and FDI-led growth. Because as you know that after Japan and Hong Kong and Taiwan, which are called the tiger economies, the so-called tiger cubs tried to follow them. Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Indonesia, they tried to be what you call the tiger cubs. Not Malaysia, but Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand. And the whole idea has been to work based on free market and try to be fully integrated in the world economic system through economic globalization. Now, a few years ago, in 2009, actually before that, ASEAN decided that it will have an economic community, a little bit like European economic community. And it was launched officially, which means that all the provisions that should take these 10 nations towards AEC were started to be put in place. And this is the ultimate aim of the AEC, which is single market and production base, highly competitive region of equitable economic development, and a region that is fully integrated in global economy. So now officially, the neoliberal system is adopted as part of the ASEAN economic model. So it's not just simply a theory anymore, this is public policy. So if you look at what has been happening in ASEAN, is that since 1970s, you can say since soon after the ASEAN economic community was, the ASEAN was established, that the ASEAN's GDP has grown 11-fold. Okay, so now it's $1.5 trillion economy. And at the same time, the subject that is close to my work, which is urbanization, we see that since 1950, there has been a more than 1,000-fold increase in the urban population. So there is somewhere, there is an overlap or a correlation between these 2 phenomena. And so I say that the cities have played a transformative role in the region's economic story. And this is the State of Asian Cities report that I was talking about. So we found out that 47% of ASEAN's population, which lives in cities, produces 80% of the regional GDP. So this is because of the higher economic productivity in the cities. And so the cities are now understood as engines of economic growth. Now, just before the ASEAN Economic Community, or AEC, was launched, McKinsey, which has been doing a lot of research, interesting research from business perspective, launched this report. And it said that in 2030, 3 parts will contribute to 19 to 42% of the regional GDP. These 3 paths to prosperity are capturing a greater share of global flows, which means you should be more integrated in the world system. Second is to ride the urbanization wave, because urbanization is happening anyway, so we should get onto this horse. And deploying of some disruptive technologies, which is happening anyway. So if you look at 2 out of these 3, you see the one colored in brown, they are related very much to urban phenomenon. So for ASEAN, capturing greater share of global flows will mean that they have to increase exports within the region as well as outside this trading bloc. And they will have to expand the manufacturing base. So where does manufacturing take place? And where does export take place? They all go through some urban systems. So then cities as spatio-economic nodes are and will be central to this pathway. So this is a map from the McKinsey report, which looks at the real GDP growth from 2013 to 2030. And what we see is that most of the growth, except for some green points, large blobs, which you see like Yangon. This is Yangon here. So this is expected with a lot of growth. So, and these small and medium-sized cities are where most of the urban growth is going to take place. However, nobody really knows how the local economies of small and medium-sized towns actually work. There's very little discussion, and only in last few years there have been some publications and policy emphasis that we should take care of these cities, otherwise they will become infrastructure and service-related problem centers. So where is the question of competitive cities if the growth will be focused in some places which are already having better infrastructure? So questions arise about the composition of local economies, how they work, and also how to bring about local economic development in these places which are barely understood. Second is the riding the urbanization wave. And now I put these figures to you that the total urban population expansion that will happen between 2015 and 2030 is about 100 million, and which will be about 6 million per year or 500,000 per month. So I wonder which cities in ASEAN can house 500,000 population, which is either going to grow because of natural growth or because of migration. Let's go back to this page again, which talks about the real GDP growth. And so initial estimates show that future economic growth will be concentrated in some pockets. So these are the pockets which show places which have 750,000 population. So rest of the area seems to have very little development, or maybe some development which is not worth mentioning on this map. So questions are there about equitable development, both regionally in ASEAN and within the individual nations. But there's hardly any discussion about this. Everybody is on the ASEAN Economic Community bandwagon. So let's look at the idea of urbanization, consumption, and environment, what is happening on that front. So the McKinsey report declared that we already have now a consuming class in ASEAN of 81 million households. And how they define the consuming class is that you should have an income level where the households can begin to make some discretionary purchases. And so there is a cutoff of $7,500 as annual income based on $2,005 rates of as the consuming class definition. So they say that ASEAN's consuming class is likely to double to about 161 million by 2030. And everybody seems to be working with the 2030 horizon, which is also the Sustainable Development Agenda horizon. So I call this as the urban power of consumption. I don't know this is good or bad, but it is certainly a very strong power. So what will be the impact of this urban power of consumption? First, of course, it will raise city-based demand for consumable goods and services. And I want to show you this graph from that report. And here you can see the ranks of different cities based on their consumption of detergent, facial moisturizer, or baby diapers. So McKinsey has done such a good homework to figure out where will be how many kids born, who will be using what kind of detergent, facial moisturizer, so they got the gender issue right. So, so while large cities are important, smaller cities come into also in this kind of consumption matrix. Now, the second impact of the urban power of consumption will be an increased demand for developed land for residential, commercial, institutional, and other public uses. And in fact, this one Filipino website actually puts a picture of Paris and show that, you know, maybe we are moving towards that kind of interesting urban situation, and says that the real estate will benefit from AEC in the Philippines because of increased infrastructure, soaring foreign investments, and intense global competition, which is all that is expected from the evolution of the AEC. The third impact of the urban power of consumption is what I call the demand for city expansion at its periphery, because there is a limit for cities to grow. And if you put too many tall buildings, if you increase the density of buildings in a city, for example, in Bangkok or Jakarta, the city starts to sink. Some parts of Bangkok and Jakarta are already sinking. And so there is already a change in urban planning policy to say that we will not allow you to build a building of 80-story high or 60-story high in certain areas. And there is a map, and everybody tries to get this map because this map tells you where the city will sink. So you better get out before your property prices go down. So I came across one of the latest plans of a city in ASEAN, which is of Yangon, because now you see after Aung San Suu Kyi came to power, there has been a lot of changes. A lot of people are going there to help the government. And it is very easy to say, because cities are always in mess in developing countries, that you got to fix your problem. So they say that from now, about 5 million population to 2040, Yangon will reach 10 million. It will become a mega city. So there's a new master plan. The whole idea, as some of you may know, that you try to decentralize the central business district by sending urban activities outward, which means that you take over the countryside land. So it talks about different sub-centers to be set up, new town centers to be set up, a second CBD will be coming up near the airport. So this is all going to alleviate the staggering population density of 365 persons per hectare in the current CBD. 365 persons per hectare is not a very big density. Actually, this is very close to the definition of an urban area in India. Anyway, so once you have the expansion of developed land, whether within the city or the periphery, what happens is that your green spaces are at risk. So here there is a list of Asian capital cities with regard to the availability of green space. The city where I live, Bangkok, is very much known for very little green space. Actually, it tops the list in having the least amount of space. But anyway, even within this situation, what you see is that because of the demand for more developed land, the green space will be at risk. And this is a snapshot I want to show you. You see here, if you look at, this is the data from 2007 in Bangkok. That is 2.3 square meters per capita. And whereas the Bangkok's official population is about 10 million. Now in this one, which is a snapshot from a newspaper for one of the mayor's campaigns, it shows that the green space per capita has increased to 5 square meters. But look at the population denominator. It is 5.7 million. So they use only the registered population as the denominator to say that, oh, the green space has more than doubled. And this is because of our green public policy. Anyway, there are some other issues. This is in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. And we already know that a lot of people are dying because of air pollution, which is called a silent killer. Now, going with mask is no more a fiction business. It is happening every day in this part of the world. Waste generation rates in Southeast Asian nations have a positive correlation with how much is per capita income in ASEAN. The fourth is that the fourth impact of the urban power of consumption is that it may spur demand for private vehicles. And there are surveys that a lot of Southeast Asian people, like everywhere else, would like to have a car, and if they have one car, they would like to have many more. This is a graph I often use, and I actually showed yesterday in the student workshop. And here you can see, this is the rate at which, on the right side, the cars per 1,000 people in US, which is close to 450. And other numbers are there. But the dotted line shows that if people in Africa, Asia, and Latin America would like to have cars at the rate of Americans, North Americans, the car numbers will go through the roof. So that's a very scary prospect. But this is part of the consumption and very much staring at us in the face. Let's go to the last part of the presentation, which is recalibrating public policy. But we should understand why these problems exist in the first place. So one is the rate at which the urban transition is taking place. And here I have found a graph to show you different parts of the world, how they reached from about 10% urbanization to 50% urbanization. And while Latin America took 210 years, Asia will take 95, because most likely next couple of years, Asia will reach 50% urbanization. And you have other regions like countries like Indonesia, which will just take 65 years, or China, which is only 61 years. because it has already reached 50% urbanization in 2011, 2010. So, and Southeast Asia is somewhere like 79 years. The second thing is that when we try to solve these problems, different kind of urban environmental problems come together. One are called poverty-related issues, which are basically to do with poor water supply and sanitation. Second are production-related issues, which are mainly pollution issues. And then consumption with a lot of waste generation, cars, greenhouse gas emissions, and so on. So, and this is, nothing can be done unless people feel there is the impact of all these issues and some action is taken. The third part of the larger problem, which is now official, is that ASEAN's development model has now been officially declared as free market, export-led, FDI intensive. But in terms of, this is a front page from China Daily. They analyzed the cost of prosperity, and I also shared some thoughts with them. In terms of environmental issues, all these countries are going after GDP growth, and they say that let's grow first and clean up later, as that is what the West did, or the North. But what is the cost of this prosperity? So this will not work for Southeast Asia or Asia for that matter, because our populations are so big that it will be a very dangerous kind of story which will be developing. Anyway, one of the other impacts of such model is that it is mainly FDI and export-led, so it generates jobs for skilled or semi-skilled people. And the profits from the companies which come from abroad are then siphoned off by those companies. And since there are no redistributive mechanisms, which we discussed very much in the morning session, the poor sections of the society do not benefit from this kind of growth. So there are concerns about jobless growth, unemployment, and poverty. These are some levels of poverty. This is not the main focus, but I just wanted to put some figures for you to reflect on. And this is one picture from Bangkok where the vendors protest because the city government wants to improve the city, make it like Singapore. They don't like the vendors on the sidewalks. And you may wonder why these people are demonstrating in the night, because in the day there is traffic. And nobody is going to stop the Bangkok traffic for poor vendors to demonstrate. They will be, sorted out, to be diplomatically correct, as you know what I mean. So, so another interesting point is that nowhere in the ASEAN Economic Community document that I showed you earlier, there is a mention of the word city or environment. So when the whole world is talking about integrating the 3 dimensions, there is another way of thinking. And this is another ASEAN community. So there are 3 communities, 3 dimensions of the community in ASEAN: socio-cultural and security community. So there is a little one paragraph called D5, which deals with promoting quality of life in ASEAN cities and urban areas. Right now, there is no desk in ASEAN to follow up on what is happening here. There is no engagement on how the cities are doing and no discussion. All what you hear normally is an award which has been set up with some international cooperation to show that some cities are doing some interesting environmentally sustainable city practices. So what are my 2 penny of contribution to this? If we have to say what the people should do, because all these agendas are decided mainly by the governments, is how shall the ASEAN and its people define a new development model? because anyway, this is such a new model that everybody is ready to embrace it. So they will have to think what matters most for them. Of course, prosperity and no poverty, which is important. What kind of social and society and culture do you want to have in terms of values, tradition, in addition to simple access to services? And what kind of nature or ecology that you would like to have as the foundation of all life so that you can give it to your future generations? And relate to our conference back, is that what kind of public policy and governance is required to achieve that vision? So these are some of the burning issues which are discussed in some conferences as ASEAN celebrates its 50th birthday. Thank you very much.
We have listened to two very interesting presentations. Now the floor is yours, but to help me with timing, may I see the hands of those who are planning to make a contribution, either in the form of questions and or brief comments. May I see the hands of those who are interested? Good, then let's go and have tea. I don't see any hands. There are two possibilities in this case. Either the two speakers were so thorough that they covered everything very clearly, brilliantly, so really there is nothing else to be done at the moment. The other possibility, of course, is that nobody understood the thing, so you are not even in a position to ask questions or to make remarks. We all know that. Yes. I have encouraged, yes?
All your graphs and figures and so on completely bamboozled me. So I belong in the category of people who couldn't understand all of the slides you showed. So if you could take a few minutes and explain in simple language what it is that you're trying to convey, I'd be very grateful.
Is it for you or?
Am I going?
Okay. May I collect one or two more comments or questions, first of all, please? And would you please identify yourself, your name and your institutional affiliation, please?
Right. Thank you to the presenters. My name is Layla Al-Baradai from the American University in Cairo, and I teach public administration, but definitely not specialized in urban policy. And I enjoyed the presentations. It's a lot of information and graphs, yes, but it's easy to understand. What I understood is that we have a lot to do, and death to the one vehicle, one driver cars, right? Not the drivers, hopefully, but we have to stop that and take care of our environment more. And maybe the reason there aren't so many questions, we're all left with a big question mark. What needs to be done? You tried, both of you, to give us some alternative answers, and we agree with you. So this is where the problem lies, that we agree with what you are proposing, but it's not really in our hands as an audience here in Rio de Janeiro to make decisions. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Do I see more hands? First three will have a free trip to Bangkok to see what Bayrat was actually talking about. Now, you want to go there?
I'm heading for Bangkok anyhow.
Okay, go ahead.
In a few weeks. No, I think Layla's last question is something worth talking about, and it's a question for both of you, but even more particularly for Paul, because Paul's presentation really rests on establishing and understanding a new model based on science and on climate science. And clearly, even in more sympathetic political leaderships, there's not that kind of understanding. So if you confused Sudarshan over here, just think of what busy policymakers will make of all of that. So my question is, what kind of steps could you take? What kind of dialogue could you start with policymakers to get them as I understand it, to first in the planetary boundaries side, to understand the question of limits, boundaries. The fact that, because we're all operating under this industrial revolution assumption of infinite growth. That's still the way all our models are still based on the idea. And when we talked yesterday in the student session about algorithms driving social media, that's also an idea of infinite growth, that the more is better, period, end of story. So planetary boundaries are important for them to understand. And then in turn, urban metabolism, the idea of the city as a living organism that that functions and that, like any living organism, can die if it's overstressed. So I think you've established some very interesting concepts. Help us think about how to make those into instruments for policy.
Thank you. You'd like both speakers to respond, I guess. This is very comprehensive, so why don't you take the floor first? We'll continue with further questions, of course, later on.
Please continue to use
Would you like to move closer so that you get a better... You all right?
Yeah, I was clearly incredibly excited to just show off lots and lots of pictures of what was going on. So I think the first lesson is certainly that needs to be much more simplified when engaging with government officials. So I mean, your question was effectively, what is my key message? And I'm going to have to ruminate over that while I sort of answer. The gentleman who asked the question about sufficiency walked in a bit late, but I would actually like to defer some of the pathways to let him. I think you had 2 more points about how we might address a sufficiency economy. So at some stage to follow up on that would be great. So for urban metabolism as a concept, I think Robin is right in saying that it is following a kind of pragmatic, science-driven exploration of how cities work. And there's a bit of a distinction between 2 approaches where you can create a vision of the perfect city and try to implement it, which is what is capturing the imagination of our decision makers. So the examples of Eco-Atlantic City, of Savannah City, of the new capital of Nairobi, are all these beautiful gated community, eco something or other, low carbon, horrible projects which won't take off because they're political instruments to move money around and they're hijacking some of the message. So the first challenge, I think, is to demonstrate what exciting things are going on inside cities. So that's the vision perspective, and many people say you must start with the vision and then work out how you get there. You demolish neighborhoods, you plonk your vision, and that's how you grow a city. Whereas this urban metabolism perspective suggests that cities, you must utilize cities' organic pathways and work out what aspects of that you can use to enhance cities. So from my perspective, informality is absolutely, not to be utilitarian, a tool for the improvement of cities. Not something to be shunned out of the streets. There's a great paper by Vanessa Watson who talks about how a planned city sweeps away the poor. So from my perspective, urban metabolism is seeking to find what causal relationships there are in cities, so connections between people and their environments and their resources, the very basic things which allow them to exist in a city, and how you can shape those towards a better city using very incremental steps as opposed to plonk the vision. In terms of convincing governments about that, I think we have to rely on the experiments and in a way yesterday's presentation from China about looking at pilot projects was one intriguing option of how to do that. But you have to come and take enough time with local government authorities to get them on the same page, I guess. Something that struck me, which I sort of didn't mention in my presentation from Bharat, is that metros or big cities often have capacity, but secondary cities don't. And so how do you take lessons from some of these bigger cities and apply them to smaller cities or bring them into larger training ones. Yeah, that was a ramble, but hopefully got some connection there. Yeah, I mean, the disconnect between academia and government is huge, and industry is huge. So my comment about the policy perspective on having intermediaries, I think, is my key answer. Western Cape, you know, and perhaps this is a top-down initiative, has been demonstrating that it wants to make data-informed decisions through a lot of its initiatives to bring in academia, to create a new research office, and Green Cape is a government entity which is providing data for the city from its interactions with industry and guiding industry. So they're an incredibly active group. So I think more intermediaries who fulfill that role, who have government say so, I think is useful. I think that's me.
Thank you for the wonderful questions. I would like to alternatives, as Laila was saying, and partly what relates to what Robin. Now, what has been happening, as we saw also day before on the student workshop, that there is a different way of doing policy analysis, is that you have a policy, you have implementation, then you have assessment. Whereas science operates in a different atmosphere, if you like, if not in the stratosphere. And between the science and practice, there is policy. So these days, there is an effort going on to try to bring these things together. I don't know if you have heard of Future Earth. Future Earth is coming up as a global platform for sustainability. And they have various, I think 7 or 8, what they call knowledge action networks, KAN. And there is one on Urban Can. So the agenda of Urban Can is being set up. And the whole discussion there is how to bring scientists, policymakers, and practitioners. And I have been to a couple of these meetings, and people are talking there with their own wavelength. The scientists have their tyranny of conceptual frameworks, as somebody noted there, that they have too many concepts, and when it comes to explaining them, they lose the language which the mayor is supposed to understand. Whereas mayor is expressing his real demand in real time. They need solution now. When I was in UN, when I used to hire consultants, and I could not hire academics as consultants because they would not understand what I'm even asking them to write in a consultant report, which the mayor that I'm working with needs. So while I'm partly an academic and I understand what is needed by policymakers and practitioners, to explain that to an pure academic was an uphill task, and I gave up. Because they start with the literature review, and I mean, you know, and the literature is always in the past. The solution we are finding is in the future. So there is a big disconnect. But anyway, that's something we have to do something about it. So at least if there is some hope, the policymaker should bring on one side the scientist closer to what should be done, and then practitioners should translate that into real life solutions. I'll give you one example. And urban transport is a very good example. Now, what happened is that although Jane Jacobs in New York was, you know, talking about removing cars and big bridges and big highways from Manhattan, when economic growth hit Southeast Asia, different cities, including Jakarta, Manila, and Bangkok, they started to build these elevated highways within the city. So if you go there, going from one place to the other, you have to pay some, you know, the toll tax to use these things. Now, what happened is that there was a study done by some Japanese-assisted international agency in mid-90s. They calculated the cost of congestion for the local and national economy. And they found that it went in millions of dollars. We are talking 1995. And that time they calculated that 90% of public investments in urban transport were going into building these elevated highways. So now we know from climate change perspective, this is a disaster investment. Anyway, so suddenly in mid-90s, the Japanese technical assistance was able to convince, and this also happened because there was a Thai student studying in Japan who helped to conduct this study, that the cost of congestion. Anyway, long story short, in late 90s, immediately 1 or 2 years after Thai government changed its policy, they started to build the underground, or the sky train, the elevated train, and it was opened in 1999. So now, although the system has taken a long time to establish, compared to Delhi, if you look at which has done much faster, and I'm not saying this because I'm Indian, but it shows that how much public sector commitment is there to create infrastructure. So now 90% of public transport investment in Bangkok goes into SkyTrain system. So you see how the science can influence real life change in policy in terms of public transport. Here I also want to say something about the rapid bus transport, because I heard from some people, and which actually came up in Curitiba, or I think some other place, Bogota. So what happens is that the rapid bus transport system works only in a small city where there are not too many cars. Still, there is a lot of roads available. And if you put this kind of system in a large city, which was created also in Bangkok and Jakarta, Bangkok ran the bus rapid transit system for several years, making a loss to the city government. Finally, last year, they closed it down. Still, that is being run in Jakarta. Jakarta is a city of 11 million people. Do you think that you can transport half of these people who are making several million trips by buses? It does not happen. So sooner or later, Jakarta has to decide to move towards a rapid transit system, not based on bus rapid transport. Similarly, there is another example I can give you on waste management, where the municipality in Bangkok did not have enough know-how on how to dispose electronic waste. You see, electronic waste, all your old computers and your phones, when they are thrown away, they do not biodegrade for very easily. So our university has been working with the Bangkok Metropolitan Administration to come up with the improved ways of disposing waste, basically trying to recycle and reuse as much material which can be done. Similarly, there are some examples on wastewater. But I also want to mention one more example, which I heard from Nick Rosna, our friend here, that in Kuala Lumpur now they have set up the rail link from the city to the airport. But when the people go to take the train to the airport, they come in their car. And so there is so much congestion just outside the railway station that nobody had calculated that you will need a car dropping point just outside your airport train link. These are simple things you could have calculated, the planner could have understood it, scientists might have helped, practitioner would have put, or policymaker would have made enough investments available for it. But now it's a mess. So anyway, these are some examples, good and bad and ugly, of how science, policy, and practice and these links work in good or bad ways.
Maybe I can suggest, or rather share, long discussions that we had covering more than a year with the participation of experts, academics, etc., the whole two critical concepts emerged. But I must hasten to add that in today's so-called democratic society, neither is possible. One of them is carrying capacity. Okay? So think about any problem, urban transformation, housing, etc., etc. Most of the problems are related to null but carrying capacity. So if there is a regime, democratic or not, which can control population, okay, and carrying capacity of transportation systems and all the other related systems, that would ease the problem. The second one is urban rent. Nobody believes that under any sort of system, urban rent cannot be eradicated. But the critical word here is who can control it. So control of urban rent is a second factor according to which emerged from our discussions. Well, any sort of rent. Any sort of rent. Because certain regimes, certain isms try to eradicate urban rent, which proved to be impossible. So the urban rent is there, but the problem is who controls it and who rechannels it according to what sort of aims and what sort of priorities. But at the end, everyone agreed that under the present regimes that we know of, neither is possible. By the way, with regards to special bus systems and other systems, it is possible, but each system has a capacity. Bus system, the regular bus, sorry. So, a regular bus system usually has a capacity between 12,000, 14,000 per hour per direction, and the maximum that bus lane, only like the one in Istanbul, which carries 1.5 million passengers per day. It all depends on the frequency of buses, and the upper limit is somewhere around 24,000, 26,000 anyway. So we are talking about different transportation modes which have to be used together and in an integrated manner. Could we have at least 2 questions, 1, 2, before we have, all right, 3, before we have a break for coffee? Please. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Nick Rosna. I'm from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. I have 2 questions, which I hope Dr. Barat Dahia could enlighten me. One, is there a good model for a livable and sustainable city in ASEAN? Second, how do we ensure sustainable urbanization and at the same time remain competitive economic region in ASEAN? Thank you.
Sorry, what was the first word you said?
Is that second?
Second, yeah.
How do we ensure sustainable urbanization while at the same time remain competitive economic region in ASEAN?
Thank you very much. Could we have your question, please?
Richard Moreta, Ranepa, Moscow. It's just in relation of the urban metabolism. It's just basically the main issue here is that we cannot continue in this process of a linear process. This is the bottom line. So we have to do a kind of like the organisms. They grow, they develop in the way that can retrofitting that all the disposal that we have in our system, we can reuse it like food until some point. So we can, we have examples already now of a couple cities already now, future cities that are in development. In Dubai, an example, that they are using all the materials from the new constructions. They are using sustainable materials that they can recycle completely and reuse it. So if we apply the same figure, the same metaphor to all the other systems in that way, that will be an approach really in the way of a really metabolic metabolism, really. No? So this is one point. It had to be a retrofitting process in the agenda. And the other situation is just in question of the transportation system. And we were speaking a little bit about that yesterday in our student section. It's just that we cannot think no more in this bidimensional dimension that we yesterday we were discussing about that. Or we had to go like an Elon Musk, say, under the ground, continually, no joke, or going in a vertical master plan. So we had to really approach the dimension of the vertical master plan, because we cannot continue spreading our footprint horizontally. So it has to be a completely rethinking all this problem, in all this agenda, in all levels. No, basically in the vertical master plan, it can be underground, it can be the sky is the limit.
Surface.
Let's say exactly.
Thank you. Would you like Paul to answer your question?
Yes,
or
both basically.
Both,
Metabolism,
either one. Could we have your question as well, sir, please?
Johan Burger, Stellenbosch University. More of a comment on a comment about politicians not understanding the kind of graphs and things. Now, I must tell a story. Around about 15 years ago, the mayor of Cape Town then was brave enough to say, yes, I acknowledge I'm stupid. I don't have intelligence. If I need it, I'll contract it in. So he said, you know, I will get support. And I think this is the richness of something like urban metabolism. It's about data-informed decisions and policies. And if that same mayor 15 years ago, that was round about the time that the warning came, Cape Town will run out of water by 2016 to 2017. And everybody ignored it until now, until there's a crisis. So now the mayor, I can guarantee the current mayor of Cape Town would totally understand the story being told for the simple reason it's Cape Town. It's her city. So she understands the maps and the graphs, and she understands the logic. And I think what the value of this kind of thing is that you can also set scenarios. In other words, you can say, if we do this, this is how the urban metabolism will respond to it. So I think it's an important policy instrument, this kind of analysis.
Thank you for the questions.
Yeah, thank you for questions. I'm glad you brought up the metaphors. Most people use urban metabolism as the metaphor of an organism. So we take resources from the environment, we consume them for economic growth, hopefully social welfare, though that doesn't necessarily happen, and outflow the wastes. And this is shifting, and we're trying to push a shift towards ecosystem thinking, which makes use of the circular process. So in ecosystems, you also have a metabolism, but it is circular. And you have your producers, which are plants, your primary consumers, carnivores, secondary consumers, tertiary, and so on. And we forget about the detritivores, which are your mushrooms and your bacteria, your snails, and everything that's supposed to break down things again for reuse. Nothing is wasted in an ecosystem. The problem with cities in our current formation is that they are not at an apex of being built. So my comment about Cape Town taking in materials for stock, it's still growing. And so at some point, we have to reach a point where Cape Town is its size it's going to be, and then we can consider reusing. But we're always going to have to take raw materials from elsewhere. So our comment about making resource efficient cities has to acknowledge that you'll always be sourcing from outside, but you can make interventions within to reuse as much as possible. You know, water should not be pumped into the ocean. That's perfectly good after treatment, and it can be reused. So it's finding the mechanisms to do that. Singapore recycles 30% of its water. You know, it's a very efficient system. Only 2% of it are lost through system losses. And with that, then we also have to choose. So as an architect, choose your construction materials based on things that are not just going to last for the life of the building, but also after use. And so that's very long-term thinking. And then finally, the comment, if you can't find a specific material or something, you can engage in resource shifting. So a water issue could become an energy issue if we desalinate. And so you can have infinite water coming out of the oceans, but then how are you producing that energy? And so thinking about how to do that. Yeah, I appreciate the comment about Cape Town's mayor. I wish to be positive about it, and I think she's learned a lesson now. But my last presentation at a conference about water was reading a poem called The Memory of Water, and the policy objective at that point was to pray for precipitation. So they learned a lesson. Finally, it's on the table. And I think with enough political pressure, Cape Town is known to be, is now a water sensitive city, and that's going to inform a lot of the planning moving forward. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick Rosner, for those $2 million questions. If there was a model, I would have already presented it of livable and sustainable city. I think it will not be very wrong to say that total livability and total sustainability is maybe a utopia or uchronia. But some cities do some things that give a semblance of better livability or better sustainability. I'm using the word better with a lot of caution here. So I do not think that across the world there is just one model of good, livable, and sustainable city. On your second question, and I would be the first person to learn and try to bring that into practice. The second question that you asked is, how do we bring sustainable and competitive urbanization together? Some very brief thoughts. One is that development normally is not locally rooted. There are not many places where all the development activities have harnessed all the creativity and all the potential areas where development can take place. For example, the local economies. You have vendors, but you kick them out. They are having their own life. They are, supporting their livelihood. That's one simple example. The other would be using the local heritage, whether through tourism or some other purpose. You may be using local resources, or you may be using your own way of life to commercialize it in such a way that it generates income for local community. These things are very much discussed in local economic development, but local economic development, improved local economic development is not practiced everywhere. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Second is that how do we, in economic terms, start to value our societies and environment? Society in the sense that you value their quality of life. Suppose you are having a poor quality of life, that should be deducted from your GDP calculation. That, okay, you are having a GDP calculation, but this is the thing that you have to take out of it. In terms of environment, I heard that in some places they try to calculate green GDP. Okay, so they say that how much part of the GDP, which means that how much part of the economic activity is not generating or having an impact on environment, and how do we increase this proportion of GDP and make it more green? That thing has not been fully exhausted, but somewhere we have to stop having total focus on GDP and try to have this green GDP, or you can say socially oriented, livable, whatever idea of urban life. And just one last point, because we know we have to go for coffee, is that for all this, in addition to linking science, policy, and practice, we will have to increase the capacity of city governments. They do not have all the capacity. They do seem to have administrative capacity, but their technical financial capacity is very much lacking. I don't think many municipal officials in many countries will have any degree on environment, except for those who just work on waste management department. So those are some thoughts. In terms of vertical city, you are trying to create a city in a architectural design, correct? That's the whole idea of a vertical city, which means either it is self-contained or it has some interface with the rest of the city. Of course, you will have to see how do you actually allow this to happen. And in urban planning, you have to have building bylaws, correct? Those kind of things do not exist right now, or if they exist, they are not fully contained buildings. So you have to have particular building bylaws and operational guidelines. I visited a building, I forgot, Zulig, is that a, Zulig is a word, no? I mean, there's some famous, very rich man in America called Zulig. Zulig. Okay, anyway, maybe I don't remember it correctly. They created a building in Manila, and we went to see, and it is considered to be a green building. It has, in its basement, 3 generators, size of a big room, and there are 3 of them, and one is always running, and there is a second one in case the first one fails. And so then there is a third one if 2 fail. So if something fails in that building, these generators are there. I wonder if there is a power failure, and that's why they are there, so that the building's air condition does not shut down. If you have that kind of thing in every building, I wonder where will sustainability go? So this is just one example that if you have a self-contained building, and it has to have its own power supply, own waste management system, own food generation system, this is a very complex thing. And a lot of work needs to be done.
We have a coffee break now, 15 minutes, please. And then we have one final presentation and still have plenty of time for questions and discussion. Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting, both of them. Thank you.
Our session is more lively.
Yes, but you never, neither of you gave a brilliant formula for totally sustainable city. I was terribly disappointed. We wouldn't be in the job. You should have said that. That's most people will accept that.
Oh my God, I just had a daydream about my future job going to Cape Town.
Hello, are you? On the presentation, are you going to share the presentation? You're probably being modest, but as long as you share it. Before the meeting, I was able to Because you have not mentioned before. Global South.
No, but that's okay. It's global south. It's not that.
Nothing wrong with it.
It's a way of describing the Yes, not just national. And actually, it's part of the bank itself. No, they don't want just national. Try to be less nationalized, less nationalizing bank than it has been for a long time. So, I mean, I think it's good this kind of good description for the thing that it's reality somehow. Yeah.
You teach at the university, learning more about you, but you're teaching.
Yes, I'm in the School of Administration of Business Studies. For me, yeah, well, administration. Also, reality.
It's a fascinating city, you know, very good. What sense? What's the reason for the increase? Economic factors, political stability? There is a culture of it's a culture. Culture parts of it are related to violence, organized crime. The psychology of the people saying that we are trapped here, we can actually break through, etc. It's a culture. It's very difficult to change. Even when economic conditions improve gradually, etc., all of a sudden, it's difficult to change. It will take time. I was part of this study going to first week about 21 areas, parts of London, which had this cultural policy. And they have declared it subsidies. We're a developed country, city like London, still.
They usually call this kind of culture, I mean, got into the city itself. It's the same basics. It's just too much capital.
Why don't you people call it this way?
It's best if you say it and me for the effect. Okay? And the links are being sent.
You have sent the links?
So, well, you can say Kadovan Khan. It's on YouTube. You want to know. Kadovan, how else will you
Oh, yes, we need for us. Yes. We are still missing one speaker, but I think we can start. I would like to, before, I will, just one moment. Before we have the final presentation, I would like to share very briefly with you, make a remark about the concept of sustainability. Here today we are talking about environmental sustainability, of course, but there is another type of sustainability, another concept, without which many of the issues, many of the problems, many of the challenges that we are talking about now could not be met. I'm referring to social and political sustainability, meaning the will of the people living in an area, living in a country, living in a city, the will to live together, the will and the intention to have a common future. I will share with you statistics, a report which just recently came out of 196 members of the United Nations in exactly 46 areas and regions, countries of the world, there is continuous conflict. And the will of the people in those countries and cities and in those regions, the intention to live together, to have a common future, is in doubt. So when you have a situation like this, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to meet the challenges of other types of sustainability, environmental sustainability, and all the other challenges facing us. So I just wanted to share this thought with you before announcing our last two speakers. Ana Lucia is going to set off, and then followed by Alexander Faria. Would you please introduce yourselves?
Hi, hello. I'm not good with technology, so please, someone help me. Okay, here we are. My idea is to not only to introduce myself. I'm Ana Guedes. I work what is a research center at FGV. It's called the Public Policy Analysis Department, and I think that you can remember that Amaro and Wagner presented the center yesterday. So today I'm here to talk about my research, and my research has been for quite a while, a partnership with Alex Faria, and we have been trying to what we call to rethink governance and management in Latin America. We have for a while a research group that has been reformulated now to be more focused on public policy. That's the reason why we submit this paper for this conference. And we have been concerned about how governance issues are managed by many different actors, national actors, international actors, and I just tried to name a few of them, but as I have just a few minutes, I need to move on. That is the framework, an interdisciplinary framework that we have been working with for a while. And it brings us some what could be called the relationship between the international or so-called international domains, international relations, international management, business, and most of all, or more important for us, when we talk about governance and management, the international political economy. I do not have time to present that. I wish I could. And then when we start to think and talk, I mean, within us at the research group about how governance could influence management and vice versa. We can name some, how can I say, institutions, some players that are quite important on that. And we are just here using a frame from Macrel, but it's just to illustrate how a complex this is and how we have difficult to work with that at the local level. And that is the case that we bring to you today. Of the Brazilian bank. We had many questions that we cannot answer easily, and that's one of them. Is there any form of global governance to manage all this process when we talk about neoliberal globalization in the last decades and how it has made a huge impact on Brazil, for example. And then we have questions regarding the definition of governance and the definition of what is, by Susan Strange, ungovernance. So the lack of political control, the lack of regulation, and how those issues are still important despite of lacking political control and regulation. And then we go to the BNDES, that is the Brazilian National Development Bank. And we selected this case when we started this specific investigation because by the time that the Amazon Fund was established at the bank, and it was in 2008, the bank has to create what we call an operational environmental area. And that is the area in which we did the research that will be presented by Alex today, okay? So if you would like to know more about the Amazon Fund, you can just visit the website of the bank, and there is plenty of information now that they are trying to be much more, how can I say, open regarding information. So Alex, I invite you to. Yes, you can, if I have time. Yeah. Which one do you prefer? This one? This one is my favorite, yeah. I wish we could stay there for a while. Yeah, it shows that the Amazon Fund is quite important because it has established something that made a change within the development bank, the Brazilian Development Bank, and has many programs that have been that received funds from the bank, and a major sponsor of this fund I must name. So I need to go back a while. Yeah, it's the major, the leading donator is Norway, and then the German Development Bank as well. Last year we had, earlier this year, we had some step backs, if I may say so, in which Norway government just made a very bad complaint at the Brazilian government, the federal government, to say that is going to review the amount of money that has been given to the Amazon Fund due to the forest fires that we have this year. So that is, it was quite a serious statement. Yes, projects that have been, they organized in this way: third sectors, federal government projects, state projects, municipalities, universities, and international projects. And this one gives us or illustrates some that have been concluded. and it goes for the Federal University of Pará and the Sustainable Amazon Foundation, the Tropical Forest Institute. So I think that it's the surprising finds, or these are the finds that called our attention in the sense that the Brazilian Development Bank is doing something, but is doing something governed by some international donor, or governed by another development bank. And that is why we are questioning how much the Brazilian bank has of autonomy regarding the federal government and those donors. Okay, may I go to Alex now? Thank you.
Alex is walking to the podium. We have an announcement to make. We are all on YouTube. So if you'd like to comb your hair and put some makeup on, YouTube FGV/SGFGV, correct? So children back home will be able to say, Daddy, I saw you on TV tonight. Yes, floor is yours.
Is it? Okay, so here we go. Okay, that's fine. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the opportunity, Anna, to come to present part of our work we have been doing. I'm a professor of strategy and society at the Brazilian School of Public Administration and Business Administration at FGV. And I'm also researching different types of council. And also, I have some position, not only in terms of consultant in management, but also I have been dealing with executive education or management education nationally and internationally. And it's part of this kind of research that we are presenting today. So this paper problematized, it's a paper, it's an academic paper. It has been designed as an academic paper, even though we are trying to make something in between in terms of being practical enough and using the language of from a more practical standpoint. But as Anna was saying in the beginning, we are trying to investigate, the environmental sustainability criteria used by this very important government development bank in Brazil. So it's a case study, it's a work in progress. We are doing investigation. And one of the issues of doing this investigation is that we don't take some kind of institutional approach. We try to get closer to people who are there managing. It's not just the bank saying or using the discourse of the bank or just getting some picture from high-profile people, but we are trying to engage with people who manage governance or manage this kind of governance criteria and agenda. So that's our entry into this practical side of governance anyway. Well, so anyway, so we use some kind of literature review. It's not necessary to have any literature review to say that this neoliberal global capitalism is full of controversy. It's not delivering exactly what it promised, and it's not necessary to get into this this kind of review to tell us about reality. And there are different types of field of knowledge that also nowadays recognize that some of those contradictions have to be sorted out, and one of them is related to this magic notion of sustainability, in which the field of management also has engaged as one particular focus of interest in terms of understanding how society, environment, and organizations at large, particularly non-state organizations, they might provide something that challenges all those controversies anyway. So there's a kind of consensus. It's a very contested consensus because if it's sustainable or not, the issue is, who's going to sustain whom and what for? And this kind of concern at the level of governance and also at the level of sustainability also has got some translation at the level of management in terms of who manages? I mean, and how is it managed? All those requirements that and layers of governance from a transnational standpoint that are just posed upon, the shoulders of those people who work at the level of managers. And it applies not only for non-state actors, but particularly in the global south, or perhaps in emerging economies of the global south, with lots of intervention from government organizations, not just private or NGOs, such as agenda in the global north has been more prone on dealing with. So that's our entry here. Okay, so right. So anyway, so the main issue here in terms of literature review is that there is a kind of report. This report it comes from the north anyway, and we recognize that there are big challenges for this kind of large agenda or large umbrella to get into reality. But it's surprising, anyway, I don't know if it's surprise, but anyway, for us, it's a kind of surprise that at the end of the day, for this large project to take place, there has been some kind of privilege toward the financial system anyway. So if those things are going to happen, it's necessary to have lots of amounts of, capital, lots of amount of finance for this large project to happen. And it's not some kind of novelty that it's not exactly the financial side of capitalism or neoliberal global capitalism that has been fulfilling this kind of job. Actually, it's otherwise to a major extent. So, especially from the perspective of the global south, it's very important to have some kind of alternative to deal with this gap, the huge gap of the agenda that comes with the privilege of the global financial system, but the global financial system is not delivering exactly what it has been promising. So that's why we get into this reality here in Brazil in particular, with some kind of predominance or a kind of surprising importance of a government development bank running or pushing, putting forward this large transnational agenda with some kind of privilege to the financial side of global sustainable capitalism. Again, the issue of, sustaining for whom anyway. So because it's a government organization, there are some national issues, there are some legislation issues, there are some issues that are not exactly transnational. It does not take place in a kind of vacuum. It takes place in a kind of context. And in the Brazilian context, for the bank to perform this job, it has to deal with some, let's say, law requirements or some kind of judiciary regime. And in particular in Brazil, the issue or the main issue that also affects the bank, and also only this bank, but banking in general, is the issue of the joint liability of the lender. So it means that, the lender is co-responsible for any environmental damage that might occur, and it has got, of course, many limitations for you to deploy agents or to get into this transnational governance if those things that are beyond your control might get into some kind of very harmful outcome. So, of course, it makes the system a bit more conservative anyway. And that's part of the problem that we got into this kind of investigation of the way managers are capable or not of managing these governance requirements and agendas. Okay, so this bank is not just any bank, even though it's located in the global south. It has been working since the 50s, when the kind of industrialization in Brazil or industrial capitalism was set with some other players within the post-Second World War. And nowadays it has become the second largest development bank in the world in terms of the disbursements, which is quite surprising, but also it's related to the way capitalism is being run in in the global south, in particular in emerging economies. So, I mean, it's impossible for us to get into this agenda of transnational governance without dealing with this national development bank, not just because this bank is important in terms of the financial system related to the privilege of, the sustainability agenda, but also because this bank has got some very surprising position in terms of any kind of global understanding of development nowadays. And what's interesting then into this context to understand this government development bank in the South, in particular in Brazil, with this kind of position within global banking or global development banking, is that they have to face, or the bank has to face, with national policy and transnational governance. So it means that, and sometimes national is not only national, but also regional because of the position of Brazil in Latin America in particular. So it is difficult for the bank to deal with all the requirements from those different origins and different agendas that take place all together simultaneously. Sometimes they are contradictory, sometimes they are complementary, but it's not easy to fulfill all the requirements of all those players, in particular the national agendas and the national agendas within the international system. So it means that most of the time, if you think in terms of the authority for governance to be managed, it's difficult to locate, in a stable way where authority is located in terms of how managers should proceed. Anyway, and apart from that, there are many other pressure groups taking place altogether, and one of the issues related to the position of Brazil within the sustainability agenda. So it means that, all those pressure groups are all together asking for the bank to move beyond not only those national and transnational requirements, but requirements that go beyond those realms, the national and transnational ones, which means lots of popular incentives, lots of popular pressures, and from NGOs and other different types of pressure groups as well. So yes, it's here. Okay. So one of the outcomes that we got during this investigation is that the bank has to compromise, and because of all those pressures and all this difficulty of putting those agendas together, and at the end of the day, they get into a kind of very narrow conception of development, in spite of all the amount of money they can mobilize. So it means that there is a lot of compromise, lots of possibilities, but there is also many complaints about the possibilities of making those actions or policies effective because of the difficulties of compromising. In parallel, the bank is part of the federal system, and government or federal government has become, the main driver to regulate and implement this sustainable development agenda. So it means that the bank has to fulfill this requirement, even though with all those difficulties of putting together all those agendas. And it explains, for instance, the many complaints nowadays, or more recently, that came out because of the way that bank has been, let's say, entrapped into this kind of, let's say, this kind of subordination towards federal government in terms of being responsible to regulate and implement the sustainable development agenda, with the Belo Monte project more recently, with lots of contradictions in terms of why the bank was playing this kind of project at the same time that it was signing many other agreements in terms of sustainability, when there are many doubts in terms of the sustainability of this project from different standpoints. Anyway, so that's part of the difficulty that the bank faces in terms of dealing with layers of governance to be capable of managing. So in terms of, let's say, our attempt at this stage of having main findings for us to move ahead, in terms of this project, which is not just a project for or research itself, but also a kind of engagement with the bank itself in terms of what kind of prescriptions the managers might get from this kind of interpretation of this reality, is that there is some kind of major constraint nowadays, which is the as money flows to those projects, I mean, there is some kind of guarantee of opacity of the bank, or perhaps some kind of secrecy, which is also guaranteed by federal government itself. So it means that the projects cannot be followed by population or by pressure groups in terms of what kind of outcome in terms of sustainability the bank has been capable of providing. And also it creates many difficulties for managers to manage because they also do not know much, given that those this kind of opacity does not make clear for managers what kind of agents they are deploying. It's like a kind of black box in which money and financing prevails, and some governance orders also prevails over the shoulders of managers. So we do not know exactly what kind of management is being undertaken, given those conditions of possibility for management perhaps not to happen. So our conclusion at this stage is that, yes, it's a very powerful, let's say, organization, very respectful organization. It's very much necessary to have this kind of organization because given the privilege that the finance system have towards sustainability, environment sustainability in particular, of course, this kind of government bank might be an important alternative, given the many failures that the system has been going through. But this issue of the layers of governance that make difficult for the bank to engage in and to fulfill those contradictory outcomes, and also, again, the issue of secrecy and opacity guaranteed by law, by Brazilian law, makes perhaps, in our understanding, some kind of conclusion that the way management has been designed into the bank for this kind of environmental sustainability governance scheme, it has been designed much more for things not to happen than otherwise, which creates some kind of our concern in terms of the governance of management within this public organization, and what kind of transformation of this kind of governance of management might be addressed in the future for managers themselves to be capable of overcoming those strictures of governance for them to create some different reality. So it means that things are there, they are available, but management has been restricted by governance at this stage, which is not a big surprise, perhaps, given the apolitical standpoint that management nowadays has been addressed not only in private organizations, social organizations, but also in particular in public organizations worldwide. So we need some kind of repoliticization of management for management to become capable of, in this particular case, of dealing with governance at this level, of those different levels. So yeah, okay, we have some reference, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. The floor is yours. Yes. Could we have the mic over there?
Thank you so much. My name is Lia. I'm a master's student in FGV São Paulo in Law and Development. And this presentation is perfect to me because I'm studying exactly, my research is about how development banks, specifically BNDES, are designed to receive the influence of civil society suggestions. So my question will be, I had the opportunity this week to interview some leaders of civil society to influence the BNDES platform to be more transparent of the bank about your investments. And one thing that they told me and the civil society are owing now is about the privatization to the bank. So I want to know what do you think about that? If this obviously can impact not only the institution, but the investments of the bank, not only in Brazil, but in Africa and Latin America and in other countries. Especially think the strategies for investment for South to South, and how this influence included for the BRICS Bank, because BNDES inspired the BRICS Bank for policy governments now. So this is my question.
Thank you. Anyone else to take the floor? 1, 2. You had your hand up, I believe. Yeah, 3.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Just a clarification and a question. Why are the donors penalizing Brazil for the forest fires and reviewing the amount of assistance that they are planning to give to the bank? If it's something, a natural disaster, why is the fund or the bank being penalized? And the other question about the restrictions in the development definition. What are examples for projects, for example, that were rejected and others that were accepted? The bank succumbed to pressures from the donor agencies, and you said that the definition of development was very much restricted. So what are types of projects that got accepted? Another off topic a little bit is the Lambada song that was popular in the 90s about the Amazon forest and how the indigenous people were trying to protect the area. Is this what you are working on? Not the song, but the protection of the Amazon forest? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Vinod Vyasulu from the Jindal School of Government and Policy in India. I found your presentation fascinating, but it's also interesting because India had a very powerful development bank many years ago, the Industrial Development Bank of India. And there was a lot of research as to which projects it funded, which companies it supported, which it did not support, and so on. But what is interesting is that about 15 years ago, it quietly converted itself into a commercial bank and is now a commercial bank. We do not have a development bank today. And at the same time, as she said, we are part of the whole new development bank and so on. And the person heading the development bank has come from a commercial bank background. He headed the biggest private sector bank in India and is now heading the NDB, but he does not have a development banking background. It's rather interesting.
Thank you. Sir? Yeah, we'll take it. We have quite a number of hands up, so may I request that you keep your remarks very brief?
Thank you. I'll be very brief. I would like to ask all the panelists to give an opinion on we all have a common denominator of this crisis, most of us anyway, which is monetary squeeze. In other words, difficulty in generating cash flow. When anything has been done successfully to change society, there's no reason why we cannot use psychology the same way that you use a new technology like the iPhone, the computer, the internet, and so on, which changes the way people get engaged and how they get engaged. People would not have got engaged without the internet in the way that they have done in so many countries worldwide. So my question is, would you find it feasible as a general principle 15 years ago, was it 16 years ago, a project called You Decide for people defining determining how much of our income we wanted to be invested in any particular sphere. So when you do your tax return, very simple to do, very low cost for any government to implement, they just have to want to do it. People would say, I want X% for education, Y% for infrastructure, health, Z%, and so on and so forth. Very few people will put their hands up and say, I want an atomic bomb or something like that, right? So we have a psychology where people, you actually get them engaged. If you then link that to the concept of annual social services, in other words, linking tax, how much tax you pay, to the amount of annual social services you do, you're basically capitalism, or socially responsible capitalism, is a socio-economically capacitating activity. And therefore, if you spend, let's say, the expertise of everybody spends, let's say, 120 hours a year just out of their normal day-to-day environment, ambient, colleagues, practices, and so on, and they go into a separate social or environmental or whatever project is needed for 3 weeks. I can give you several examples which where people simply renewed their lives because they got out of a dogmatic mindset of doing what they have to do every day, and they suddenly met new friends, new business opportunities, and also, in very many cases, created new technologies or new ways of doing the business. There's a big rumor, for example, everybody knows the Swatch, the wristwatch. When the Swiss couldn't compete with the Japanese, they found a way. Why? And it happened with a meeting at one of these meetings of the 3 weeks they had for people to get together. It was military conscription at that time in Switzerland. So there's no reason why we cannot use the same psychology that's used for marketing tangible things for the intangibility of getting things done.
Thank you very much. Sudhir-san, could we have the last one to give everyone a chance? Go ahead, please. Mike, over here.
No, my request is to invite all the panelists to reflect upon some implications of the last presentation that we heard from Dr. Faria, which are these internal contradictions in this idea of sustainable development, and the fact that, you know, references to the development bank and what it does. It seems to me that we still haven't got to a paradigm shift in understanding the situation. It's simply an extension of you know, ideas that have been largely dominated by economists and by market ideology that enters into the framework of now called sustainable development, right? And so it's a very, it's a knowledge epistemologically. It's what it does is it thoroughly and totally marginalizes people who are not useful, whose activities don't connect to the market. Anything that money cannot buy is irrelevant and useless. And this is the predominant view. And therefore you convert, you know, nature, you know, with all its wonderful species and living things into something called environment. And then in the name of protecting the environment, you create sanctuaries, you drive out people, you put people against tigers. You know, this is all horrendous. And I think at some point we ought to seriously question this, because we can carry on in this way as if we've now discovered a new thing, sustainable human development after human development. And also in the human development paradigm, I mean, for all the years since 2000 till today, 17 years of human development reports, I cannot find in any of them a serious critical analysis of the macroeconomic framework of the world and the framework translated into national policies in practically every country. So without it, you're then saying, oh, we'll help this lot, you know, in this way. And very often you are doing something and then you get millennium villages and you write wonderful stories about them, when that millennium village is probably impoverishing 10 other villages in the vicinity because of the concentration of resources. And so there is no serious questioning of these things. And I think at this forum, we need to get into a critical mode. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anna and Alex, your turn to respond.
I have some difficulty. I will try to do my bit of it. So your question, first question, I think that we can even exchange email and then talk more about. But from my experience during this research project at the bank, it's quite clear that the bank is not prepared to, how can I say, hear or talk or exchange. And I think that we have a few, some examples in the last 5 years in which the bank has behaved quite badly in terms of not even open the door to talk with people that have been at the front door complaining about Belo Monte, for example. So that was a huge mistake. They have been trying to learn how to deal with that. So Plataforma BNDES that you named, it's quite important to pressurize. During this data collection, I talked with different 3 NGOs, quite important one based on one of them is national-wide and the other 2 are located in Rio. And from the data that I got from them, BNDES is quite, how can I say, is doing quite well in terms, in operational terms, in managerial terms, but lack the ability to communicate what it has been doing in terms of internalizing the environmental criteria that was set by the agreement with the World Bank, and then by pressure of the federal government to sign the agreement with the World Bank. So it's quite tricky to make all the connections. And I think that when we talk, I did another comparative research, 7 development banks, including China, German, I cannot even name all of them, India, Korean, and all together. And from there, from that comparative research, it's quite clear the importance of the Brazilian bank within BRICS and within the new development bank. So I don't know how to answer your last comment regarding privatization. I think that I should not comment it here because it's I think that it's out of the scope of this research. We are not questioning if it is or it should be or not a state bank. We are just trying to realize or find out how a bank, in this case is a state bank, is trying to internalize the environmental concern. Okay.
Thank you. Alex? Is the mic open?
Is it okay now? Is okay? Is this? Yeah. Okay. See, so if you think in terms of addressing some more sensitive issues, well, if there is this kind of sustainability agenda, and it comes with some kind of neoliberal capitalism project as well, of course there are some contradictions, and also there have been many criticism on the idea of the existence of government development banks, I mean, worldwide. So it's not exactly what the dominant project expect it to happen to a major extent. So what I'm saying is that if this privatization of the bank now is getting into the headlines, it's not something new. All those ideas that have been flowing for a long time. I mean, it's also related to the dismissal of development itself, and perhaps the takeover of development itself, with all the variance of development, all the political agenda that comes or have come with development itself. I mean, through the third world, for instance, I mean, it has been going through a very serious attack from the ones who offer the voice, who announced the end of development in a way. So what I'm saying is that what is quite surprised in terms of what we are doing, and we are not getting to this kind of debate, is how distant this kind of debate has become to the bank itself. I mean, the bank does not get into those very serious debates for many different reasons. So I think that it's related to some kind of very serious and important impoverishment, not only of the bank itself, but also for the system that serves the bank. For instance, I work in as a researcher and as a faculty of a public administration school and also a business administration school. And development itself has become something that is not exactly part of the curriculum, even though we all know that, I mean, development has been in the hands of, you know, different types of players and actors and agents, but there is some kind of epistemic dismissal of those very important issues that also takes place within the bank. So I'm not very much concerned just with the privatization or not. I think that we're talking about the big agenda that has been mobilized by different actors, and particularly even banks who are not exactly the global bank that is not for development. They are making interventions of development worldwide, and it has been going through for a long time. So if you are critical in those terms and get into your comment in terms of this, of the hands and in which hands this bank belongs to, I think and we think in terms of project is that one of the main limitations of this bank and of this picture is that the bank is just this bank, and other banks are failing in terms of creating alternative developments, not just sustainability for a particular type of development. I mean, we have to create alternative developments, and perhaps in the case of Brazil, we don't have many banks. We should have more banks. We should not just have one bank with all the power within one bank, because it's very easy to control. Anyway. So we should have more alternative banks, and also, such as you are suggesting, perhaps, we might also think in terms of alternatives to development, because we all know that development is part of the solution, but it's part of the problem as well. And so I think that's the main problem that we're facing in terms of what kind of management. In our surprise, even though those debates are quite far away from the bank, they are very much there, because, but I mean, they are like kind of, you know, it's almost dead, but it's not dead yet. It's just going through and surviving to some extent. So perhaps society might be of some importance to reactivate this possibility of creating a kind of alternative development banks in Brazil with different types of designs, and also to insist on the possibility of having alternatives to development, but not giving the back to development itself, because it could be a very important path towards suicide. So that's our main impression. Your question, the suicide, I mean, I think that one can be better than.
Yes, go ahead.
May I just, yeah, I tried. That's quite a challenge one, okay? But I present a table in which I name a few projects. Those are projects that have been accepted to be sponsored under the Amazon Fund. That sort of project, it's quite aligned with what civil society or what better NGOs, environmental NGOs wish in national and international terms for the Amazon region. So there is a close alignment there. They work in partnership. They even name which institution they wish the money to go to, and which sort of project they want for the Amazon region. So it's quite fine. The problem is when the federal government decides to do projects that are not really aligned with the Amazon Fund, and those projects that have a different scale, a different purpose, like Belo Monte, for example. So the problem is that we do not have, how can I say, an alignment between the national government and the donor and the bank. regard much more broad interests.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to take the floor? Any questions to our speakers? Would either of you like to make brief comments about the questions? Yes, yes, yes. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll just, our friend there, psychology of making connections. In my study, I have kept all the people I have met their business cards, and I think there are more than 1,000. I tell you, what you were talking about is networking, and then going beyond networking and try to do something. That thing only works when you have the meeting of demand and supply. If somebody has an idea, there is a buyer of that idea, or you can do something, somebody wants that, it works. Otherwise, that business card becomes useless. Very simple. Regarding Sudarshan's point, I think I was very critical in my presentation. But anyway, since I have worked with the World Bank, just very quickly in 6-7 sentences, I'll try to summarize. The World Bank is originally called the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development. It was not set up to do sustainable development. The time IBRD was set up, America did not go through suburbanization and the use of automobile and the things that came up in 50s and 60s, which realistically landed up everybody questioning the whole idea of using a fossil fuel in 70s, Club of Rome, and after 15 years, we have the Brundtland Report. The amount of intellectual energy that has gone into creating economic growth has not gone into creating really sustainable development. This is a failure of all academia. As an academic, I'm party to it. It's a failure of policymakers. If you want to look at what happened in Rio 92, there is a very small video of a young girl who is talking about you all people coming here together and you should listen and you should do something. 25 years down, nothing. Rio asked people to integrate social, environment, and economic dimensions. Hardly any work has gone in. And the 2015 agenda of 2030 SDGs, first thing it says is that you have to integrate these three. Even today, hardly any work is being done to integrate these three. Okay, so what you have is a total failure. Then last year, there was a conference organized in Bangkok by the Focus on Global South called Deconstructing and Reconstructing Sustainable Development. There was a session on urban. Some slum dwellers organizations came, and I was looking at them. They were almost in tears when they were talking. And what they were saying is, this sustainable development is not for us. We are already being thrown out from the sidewalks. So this is not for, there's no housing for us, there's nothing for us. So my take is this, and this is what I share with my students, is that we have all of this you can take to one place. And that is the way the 21st century education based on specialization has been rolled out. And that is based on Descartes' this idea of deconstruction. So if you deconstruct knowledge and you make silos, right now I follow what kind of new journals came up. So there is a new journal called Urban Climate. Few people have their own intellectual ecosystem, and they will just start a journal and they are just listening to each other and publishing, quoting each other. There's no synthesis. So what you have is, within universities and research institutes, the education given and the research done is silo. That leads to you working into governmental or non-governmental or private sector organizations which are based on silo. Then you have policies which are silo, and the practice is silo. So it's all based on the way the knowledge is constructed. the knowledge is not constructed in a cohesive, integrated, synthesized way. And as a result, we talk of interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity. We can't get our methodologies together. We are, as somebody said in the PEC's 2015 conference in Stellenbosch, we have a tyranny of conceptual frameworks. So we have just ideas trying to coalesce ideas with each other, but none of these things make sense to anybody listening. So we say, I don't know what you're talking about. Okay, so it is such a broken system from top to bottom and bottom to top that it will take a big amount of intellectual energy to fix it. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul?
Oh, I mean, that's a hard one to
Let
follow.
us not end on a very
well, I mean, in brief response to some psychological perspectives and psychological interaction, I think this is noble, but I'm not sure how it emerges without addressing supply and demand. For example, behavior is going to be changed in Cape Town because of water scarcity. Whether or not that continues is questionable. I'm quite intrigued by a lot of behavioral economics and behavioral nudging approaches, which are trying to work out how you guide people towards healthier lifestyles, more efficient behaviors. But again, who is deciding on what those are? And so some work by Lorenzo Fioramonti, who is sort of pioneering a notion of well-being economy, is trying to suggest that we can use cryptocurrency as a way in which you get buy-in from a number of actors to promote spending that money on goods and services which promote welfare and well-being. And so it allows you to interact. But again, how widespread that becomes, I'm not sure. And then, I mean, I think that was the best summary of your reflection. But if I can basically summarize it, I think
Thank you.
The failures, sorry, I want to summarize it. But the failures described before are because economists came in and spoke with certainty, which appealed to our need for certainty in these spaces. So I think to put a positive spin on what we can do about it, I think it's an individual role to actively critique this certainty and promote living in a space in which uncertainty is okay. And that's an incredibly hard challenge because people want certainty, constituents of governments want certainty, but if we say uncertainty is okay, and you critique the economists who come in and tell you that their models are fine when they exclude social ills and environmental goods, come on. So a shift from certainty to uncertainty, from centralization to decentralization, from a notion of trade-off to embedded actions, can do multiple things at once, breaking down departments and discourses, and reorganizing based on interactions, and then multi-stakeholders to allow participation. So that would be my summary.
Thank you. Robin?
Very nice, Paul. I mean, I want to compliment everyone, but particularly the last two comments I think have been very valuable for all of us. And I subscribe to pretty much everything you said. If there is, and Corel said, let's not end on a down note, you've all identified in different ways, and it's come up in other papers, and it's come up in the last 2 days in our student panels. It's again the inability of different sectors and different types of siloed knowledge. I thought you put that very well, to communicate and get through to each other. Public policy as a field of study offers a glimmer of hope, because it starts by training people to be able to understand these different languages, to speak these different languages, to be interpreters, translators, and communicators for ultimately policymakers who have very short spans of attention and very many pressures on them. I think that you both offer some kind of way looking forward. As academics, and I like your confessional tone. You're one too, I'm one too. We're all academics in one sense, although I sometimes bridle when people call me an academic. But our disease is this business of problematizing things. We want to create a theoretical framework in which it's a problem, and a problem that can't be answered, that can't be solved. Public policy at its best, and public policy is, we all know this, those of us studying it, those of us learning it, those of us teaching it, is an imperfect discipline. It's not even a discipline, it's an imperfect instrument. But nevertheless, it attempts to get beyond the problematizing frame of mind. So this panel, I think, has been a wonderful way of thinking about that. And the best panels always leave you thinking that you need to know more about things, and that was true of all of them. So thank you.
Thank you. Celso, any closing comments? Okay. So I would like to, of course. Okay. On behalf of you, I would like to thank the speakers, and I would like to thank you, all of you, for enriching the session with your comments and your questions. And I'd like, there are one or two individuals in this room who I'd like to name and show our appreciation to them. Of course, to Veronica and Carlos and their team. I don't hear any applause. Louder, louder. Hey, hey, louder. Would you please come forth? Please come to me. Please. We thank you for your energy. Thank you. All right. Until tomorrow, have a pleasant evening.
And may I also ask your applause for this nice chairperson we have had.
All this was rehearsed. We talked to one another. Okay. Have a pleasant evening. Thank you very much.